Hello, everyone. Can everyone come forward and take your seats? We're going to begin. We have some papers on the tables that you are welcome to take and follow along with and take notes on. Okay, we're going to start our program now.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Iliff School of Theology, where we advocate freedom. If you've not seen that or heard that, that's the new statement we're making as to declaring who Iliff is in the world. We advocate freedom, and we are delighted to welcome you here this evening. I know that this is home for the Women's Alliance, so I'm welcoming you home. And yet, the house is a little different. We're undergoing some remodeling, and I'm not talking about rooms being changed. I'm talking about the ethos being remodeled. We're declaring who we are and what we do in the world in new ways and in new places. I don't like to introduce myself this way, but to be more formal, I am the Reverend Dr. Lee H. Butler, Jr., and I'm the new, recently installed president of the Iliff School of Theology. Thank you. I am the 17th president and the first non-United Methodist president of this very distinguished institution. One of the early changes that I made in coming to Iliff, every president that has preceded me has had the title of the Bishop Henry White Warren Professor of, whatever that faculty person's field would be. Well, I looked at that, and recognizing something about the history of Iliff, I wondered, why was the bishop's name the only name used in this professorship? What do I mean by that? If you know anything about the history of Iliff, it was not the man's money that established Iliff. It was the woman's money that established Iliff. And so I moved to change the title into the Bishop Henry White Warren and Elizabeth Iliff Warren Professor of. I thought the Women's Alliance would appreciate hearing that. And so we are delighted to welcome you here, to welcome you home, as your programs have been an important part of who we are, declaring what we do, of bringing vital conversations to the fore. And tonight's event, Dying Well, is a critical conversation on what it means to see the full continuity of life. So many of us see death as something to be feared, something to escape, and we do lots of things to avoid thinking about it. But that is a way of denying what it means to be alive and the continuity of life, which includes death. And if you haven't guessed by what I just said, when I was a faculty professor, my field was pastoral care and counseling. So So I'm just so glad that we are here together, gathered together to have this vital conversation on dying well, especially in the aftermath of all the death we experienced during COVID, the trauma of the death we experienced during COVID, the folks who did not have an opportunity to die well by saying farewell, to hear the farewell, to help them transition because we have touched them and said, safe passage, and greet our relatives on the other side. So I'm glad you're having this conversation, and do enjoy your time here this evening. And now I turn it over to, I believe, Mary Rayner.
Thank you, President Butler. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see such a big group of people who are interested in engaging this topic. I'm Mary Raynard. I'm a member of the Women's Alliance, and it is my great good fortune to introduce our moderator. But first, a few housekeeping items. Bathrooms are straight out that way, turn right, and down at the end of the at the end of the hall. Yeah, we have water and coffee, and we have delicious food. So please help yourself. Please feel free to get up and help yourself whenever you are feeling the urge. The Women's Alliance was started in the 1990s, for those of you who aren't familiar with the group, started in the 1990s as a way for the women of the Iliff organization, across the organization, to know each other and to interact with each other and to support each other. Now in the 2020s, the Women's Alliance has two main areas of focus. One thing we do is we raise money for a scholarship for women who are interested in attending Iliff. And I'm delighted to say we have a wonderful student that we're supporting this year who is here from Guatemala, and she is enriching all of our lives. The other thing that we do is we put on these phenomenal programs. We've put out, and that the programs are intended to take us out into the broader community and to reach outside of Iliff and share some of what we do with the larger community. We've had programs on eco-spirituality. We hosted a program with women candidates, a candidate forum, women candidates who were running for local office last year. We had Joy Harjo come, and we had a wonderful, beautiful artistic evening. So those are some of the programs that we've done in the past. And we will continue to do more programs, and we hope that you will continue to come and enjoy them. For our program tonight, Dying Well, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Kelly Arora, PhD. Kelly is assistant professor, Dr. Arora is assistant professor in the Interprofessional Graduate Certificate and Master of Science in Palliative Care programs at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. She is also the John Wesley Iliff Senior Adjunct Lecturer in Spiritual Care at Iliff School of Theology. Dr. Arora is the recipient of the 2023 General Internal Medicine Excellence Award in Palliative Care from the CU School of Medicine. Her book, Spirituality and Meaning Making in Chronic Illness, How Spiritual Caregivers Can Help People Navigate Long-Term Health Conditions, was published in 2020. Dr. Arora serves as president of the board for Centus Counseling, Consulting, and Education, and in her copious spare time, she maintains a private practice in spiritual direction. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kelly Arora.
Thank you, thank you. I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk about one of my favorite topics. We have a great aversion to talking about death in the United States, so I'm excited to help normalize that conversation with our gathering tonight. What we're going to do tonight is that I'll speak for a bit, and then we have 4 panelists who are also going to talk about dying well from their particular professional perspectives. And then we'll have some time for you all to talk a bit and process what you've heard, and we'll come back together and do some more question and answer and conversation, all of us as a group. So that's our plan. But first, as we talk about death and dying tonight, you might experience some emotions around those words related to your own mortality. You might have feelings about loved ones, other people you know who have died or are in the dying process currently. You may feel some grief come up about past experiences. So we're going to take a moment to pause and quiet and acknowledge that. So I'm just going to invite you for a moment to get really comfortable in your chair. You can close your eyes or just softly look down. And take a few slow, deep breaths. Our intention is that this is a safe space for all thoughts and feelings to arise without overwhelming us. As you continue to breathe softly and deeply, imagine a simple, empty container next to your chair. Whatever comes to mind for you is fine. Could be a box, a bag, even a hole in the floor beside you. Symbolically place in this empty container any thoughts or feelings that may distract you from being fully present. You can include thoughts about your day, expectations of what might happen this evening, any pressure you might put on yourself to experience tonight in a particular way. You can trust that everything you place in this container now and throughout the evening will be safely held for you. Now, with your eyes still closed or your gaze down, I just invite you to lightly place your fingertips on your temples. Let's do this with the intention that our minds remain open to new ideas and different perspectives. Now, place one or both palms over your heart. We do this with an intention to offer compassion to ourselves and to the other people here tonight. Finally, turn your palms up in your lap. And with this, we intend to receive whatever will serve you and the people you care for in your web of life. With one more deep breath, you can open your eyes and return your awareness to our space. Thank you. I have a feeling this represents how some of us in this room might feel, right? Sure, death doesn't sound so bad. Let me just avoid it, right? That's true for a lot of people. In fact, many of us here probably hope, I'll just die quietly in my sleep and drift into whatever's next, and all of this discussion about all these other things will be irrelevant, right? Unfortunately, that doesn't usually happen. This is an adage, I've heard this so many times over the years. The percentage may be off a little, but I think it's pretty accurate, that about 70% of people wait for their physicians or other care providers to bring up the topic of dying and death. And about 70% of those care providers wait for the patient, to bring up the topic of dying and death. So we don't really talk about it, right? So we're hoping we don't have to, and then we don't address it when we have a chance. But tonight we're gonna change some of that. So why do we avoid talking about death, particularly in the U.S., because that's our context? In other cultures and other places in the world, it's very normal to talk about death and dying. In fact, the bodies of loved ones may stay in the home for even years as the family continues to honor them after their death. So we have very particular ways of thinking about this topic here. So some common barriers are culturally, we've what I call medicalized death and suffering. We are a delayed gratification culture. I don't want to suffer anything, so there must be a pill for that, whatever that is in our life. Even within the medical community, providers still see death predominantly as a failure, not the natural end of things. We also have a lot of fears about dying, right? What happens during, what happens after, the fear of being alone in that, that's a biggie. And then, of course, there's a lot of jargon around it that we don't always know how to address. And even the simple words of death and dying and died, we transform with euphemisms that are often really confusing, particularly for children and adolescents. Keep that in mind. Talking about to grandchildren, children, when we talk about went home, expired, passed. We do that because we're uncomfortable talking about it, and especially with kids, we really confuse them. So we put off anything that's challenging in terms of the language, the vocabulary that we use. And then, of course, we'd all like to avoid a lot of family conflicts about the things that we might secretly want or not want when we're dying or after death that we know members of our family or other loved ones might disagree with. And so we don't share our wishes and we don't ask about theirs because of those kinds of conflicts. So tonight, here's an opportunity to practice using the real words, because that's really important. When we do suicide awareness training, we all have to say out loud those kind of practices. Are you thinking about harming yourself today? Are you thinking about ending your life, killing yourself today? We have to practice saying those things so the words actually come out of our mouth. So tonight, please practice death, dying, died, the real words. Okay, it's a good chance to do it in a safe place. So what does dying well mean to you? And it's really important that we frame it that way, because the answer to this question is unique to each person in this room. We all have particular wishes, we all have particular meanings and beliefs and values that go into what dying well will mean for us. So tonight's about starting, perhaps, or continuing that conversation with yourself about what this means for you and what it might look like, or how you might talk with other people that you care about what it means for them. So we probably won't have the answers for you, but we might have some good questions for you to think about. And I think that's really important. That said, there are many studies out about what people do mean when they talk about dying well. And these are some of the most common themes that come up. Now, the order of priority that you might put them in, of course, is going to differ from someone else. You'll notice that these kind of cover all aspects of mind, body, spirit, community, different parts of life, but these tend to be important things. So these are things for you to keep in mind also of how you might want some of these things to be addressed. Remember also, we can express our wishes and we may have no control over what actually happens to us at the time. So as important as it is to think about this and do some planning and sharing and conversations ahead of time, there's also the realization that I'd just like you to keep in mind that everyone may have to adapt and do that on the fly. Okay? So there's some things to think about there as well. In addition to your own inner beliefs and values, there are other external influences that may even change how you would answer that question of what dying well means at any particular time in your life. You know, your financial situation may change dramatically. There may be changes in who can or is willing to provide care, what that looks like, or how you're providing care to someone. And not only are these factors in what dying well means for you, there are a lot of other people in your world, people and institutions, that would probably be happy to weigh in with their opinions and perspectives on the topic too. That can be supportive in many ways, because there's a lot of places you can talk about things, and it can be challenging too when you feel conflicts with that. So just keeping that in mind and noticing that. Okay, our topic is really big, so I'm going to put a few boundaries around it for tonight and what we're able to cover. So here's our timeline from birth to death, all right? Very large. This first piece, we're going to call passive dying. We usually talk about it as living. But honestly, from the moment we're born, we're passively moving toward the end. And I say passively because we generally aren't really thinking about it. Again, our tendency to avoid and just kind of roll with it, okay? Then there's an active dying phase where your body's shutting down. Although that process is happening, there's really not much else anyone can do. This can happen in a matter of seconds, accidental death, all kinds of things, or it may be a much longer process for some people. The next phase is technically after the dying is over, right? The post-mortem phase. And what happens to your body, then you're really out of control with what's going on. You can express your wishes for that. So tonight, however, we're going to talk about what I'm going to call sort of an intentional dying phase. So it can cover sort of toward the end here where we start to think about this seriously. I take it that that's why you all are here tonight, because you're willing to at least engage the idea that it's going to happen. And you might want to think a little bit about it. So not active dying yet, hopefully no one in here tonight, but we have people who can handle that. But that's kind of where our focus is going to be. So we're going to be thoughtful about this and intentional about it, and I hope that's what you continue to do when you leave here as well. So here are some topics that might come up in this intentional dying phase. You'll notice a lot around spirituality. That's not just because that tends to be a big piece of our perspectives, the panel and myself, but also because this tends to be what's important the closer we get to the end of life. So these are sort of fair topics for our conversation. And then topics for another time include sort of what's going to happen to your body, how people might celebrate you once you're gone, those kind of things. I'll give you some, there's plenty of places you can look for information on that. So we're not going to answer questions about green burials and all that good stuff, okay? So everybody kind of knows the territory we're in, and it's still a really big topic. So let me give us another framework that we can kind of use to think about some of this too. This is on the handout. These particular next couple slides are on the handouts at your table just to help you think about things on the backside of the bios. Thanatologist Kenneth Doka, so he's just an expert on death. It's also his passion. He has described different tasks that are really common to different phases of people living with serious illness. Now, the reason I use this in talking about dying well is because, for one thing, we treat aging as a serious illness in this country, so that's part of it. And you guys may be aware, too, that about 50% of people have at least one chronic health condition, 50% of adults in the US. So if you don't have some sort of health condition you're living with now, you probably will have as you get further along that timeline. So these phases are helpful. So we're going to look at that. The Centers for Disease Control also says that most people in the US die suddenly of a chronic health condition. Okay? Because that's how it feels. Even though we're planning for it, it's happening. Okay? The diagnostic phase. So for us, if you're just in the aging process, in the passive dying process, this may just be the place where you're just recognizing, oh yeah, it's going to happen, and acknowledging that dying is real for you and it's coming at you. So in this phase, it's a lot of exploration and sort of getting used to what's going on. I've broken Doka's work into the mind, body, spirit, and community just to help think about that. It tends to kind of hit all those different places. It usually starts with what's going on with our body and then sort of ripple effects through the rest of ourselves as whole persons. So there can be some initial meaning making and some more spiritual work early on, but usually that comes a little bit later. If there's a chronic phase of living for a while with some sort of conditions or whatever, then we have opportunities to do some different things. You'll notice the words here are more about managing, maintaining. It's kind of the ongoing living with and finding well-being in the midst of dying, aging, illness, those pieces. Not everyone gets a recovery phase. If you have a serious illness like cancer or something, for example, not everybody gets a respite from that where things kind of get better for a little bit and everybody gets a chance to breathe and think again. And if you die suddenly, you definitely don't get that peace to do that. But that tends to be a time when people have more capacity to consider some of those bigger existential and spiritual questions and do some work in that kind of way. And then finally there's that terminal phase, which again, may last seconds, may last years. Don't really know what's coming up, so there's a chance to consider some of these things now while you have an opportunity and kind of get a head start on that, do your homework a little bit. Palliative care physician Ira Byock discovered in his practice with people dying that these 4 acts or these 4 tasks were most important to people. So he wrote a book, The 4 Things That Matter Most. And these are things that we can be working on at any time, right, as we're passively dying. I have an asterisk by forgiveness. Just always want to point out, no matter how great of an idea we feel like forgiveness is, we can't impose that on anyone. People don't forgive until they're really ready to do that. So even though lots of studies show how helpful that is, how beneficial it is to both parties, sometimes that just doesn't get to happen. But it can be very important when it does happen and very beneficial when it happens. You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that the toughest relationships in which to receive or ask for or give forgiveness are between parents and their adult children and between spouses or partners. Of course, the relationships that matter most, it's the toughest to do sometimes to overcome those barriers. Okay, so these are some things you can consider working on. How do people die in the US? That first box, natural death, everybody would like to fit into that one, but we don't. There's all kinds of different ways that people's lives actually come to an end. And this, of course, doesn't even really separate out like accidents and, other things that happen. So death comes in many different ways, some of which we can be more or less prepared for. But they're things we might want to think about. So a lot of people feel like they'd really like to die at home in the comfort of their home, and not that many people get to. One reason why that is true is because many people haven't completed the documents, the advance directive documents, to state some of their wishes. So we can get to a place where we just aren't able to communicate or aren't able to really make our own decisions, and things happen to us and for us and on our behalf. And it's not always what we'd like it to be. So that's something to think about. That's, I believe, on your handout also just a list of what these documents include. If you haven't ever addressed any of those, then you can find lots of information on the internet about them. But it's really important to get some things in writing, or at least have people know what it is that your wishes are. I get asked a lot about medical aid in dying because it's legal here in Colorado. So I did want to say a few words about it. There are legal qualifiers to it. You have to, be close to that active dying phase. A physician does need to write the prescription for you. You need to know that in Colorado, like in the Denver area, that not all physicians will have the conversation with you. For example, physicians working like in the Centura, the Caring Spirit system, their policy is that they don't support that. They would refer you out. So that's something, if this is something you'd want to consider or learn more about, you maybe want to find out if your own physician is even someone who can help you with that. So that's a big surprise for people sometimes. So this is something you have to be able to do on your own. It's different from someone else giving you medication. That's euthanasia, or has other language around it, mercy killing, other names. So this is you making the choice, administering a medication yourself. So the most recent statistics I have for Colorado show that it's about 50-50 women and men who have requested medical aid in dying prescriptions. It's gone up significantly, 44% increase over 2021, you can see. Now, 78% actually used the prescription medication that they were prescribed. And there are reasons for that. Maybe they were no longer able to self-administer. Maybe they didn't have time. They died before they could. Maybe they had it planned out on Wednesday and Monday they died. And some people change their minds. So that happens as well. So that's just kind of FYI, what the latest is there. So finally, I want to mention professional and family caregivers. So you might be caring for, or in the future will care for someone as they're dying. So again, just remembering dying well is unique for every person. And family members, it's really common that they're surprised that people change their minds about things, even in the last hours, the last days. Whoa, Grandpa always wanted X, or, my brother never wanted Y, and now they want what? Because in theory, pain and fatigue and incontinence and diminishing mental capacity, all those things, it's one thing to think about it, it's another thing to experience it, especially for an extended time. So just know that might happen. We teach in our palliative care master's program, not the golden rule. It's not doing what you would want, but it's doing what that person would want in the dying process. So we go by what's called the platinum rule. There's a lovely article written about that. So this is a framework for our conversation. And now I'm going to invite our panelists to come up. And each of them is going to have a few minutes to talk from their particular area of expertise. And I'll just prompt each of them with a question about that. About what dying well means and how they, from their perspective, can support that. And then after that, we'll have a chance for y'all to talk for a few minutes at your tables, and then we'll come back together and have some more conversation up here, and then with you all with some final questions. Okay? Thumbs up? Everybody's with it? Okay, cool. All right, panelists, why don't you come up? Super. So you have bios on your table for reference as well, but they may also say a few words about their background as part of what they're talking about. So we're going to start with Tonya, and Tonya is going to talk about what is hospice versus palliative care, and how can hospice support dying well?
Hello or good evening, I guess. It's kind of like, it's the light evening. My name is Tonya Hunt. I am an RN. I actually just hit my 20 years in nursing last week, which included graduating with my Doctor of Nursing Practice, so that was pretty exciting. I share all that, one, because I'm still just really excited, but two, to say my experience and my focus and my coming here with you all this evening really comes from a place of, one, I really care about people and what happens to people. I became a nurse because I originally thought I was going to be a labor and delivery nurse and just deliver babies for my whole career. Life changed, and I actually was working on a med-surg unit at one of our hospitals here in the Denver metro area, and I had a patient who was dying. They had all the tubes, lots of drains, and all I just kept thinking is they were still kind of in and out of consciousness. And I remember being in that shift as I'm continuing to give more medications, giving more tube feedings. They're barely breathing, they're barely there, but there's still a full code, so we have to keep going. And I was thinking, what are we doing? What is the quality of the life of the patient that I have here in front of me? And it was then that I started talking to some other nurses that I know about what are some other areas of nursing that I could possibly go into. And I had a friend of a friend who talked about hospice, and I was like, oh, I don't know if that's for me. I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, I'm supposed to eventually get back to babies. I don't know what's going on. I started out, very PRN for a hospice company, and I've never looked back. I have actually been doing hospice and palliative care for over half of my nursing career so far. What I have been able to do in my line of work is give people, as we've been talking about, what their end-of-life quality looks like for them. And it is truly different for every single person. There are things that are similar, some things that are, that we kind of follow that process. We know that for someone to qualify for hospice, they need to have a terminal illness. They're also, with that terminal illness, they've already been diagnosed with 6 months or less to live if that illness were to continue. Some people think they hear the word hospice and they're like, oh my goodness, you're going to kill my loved one. They're already dying. What we get to do in hospice is we get the opportunity to say, you're already dying. What do you want that to look like? What do you want to have, to the best of our abilities, keep you home? Some people are very determined they don't want to be home, actually. Those percentages were actually very interesting to me because it's true. A lot of people start out and be like, oh no, I'm going to stay at home till the very end. As they get closer to the end, we're working very quickly to get them placed to maybe one of the other local communities because they're like, they don't actually want to die at home, or maybe it's a little bit harder for their loved ones than they thought. Some are already in maybe a skilled nursing facility, and then their loved ones bring them home for the last days. So it really just depends. So when I was thinking about the concept of what does it mean to die well, it truly is what we each want, What do we want that to look like? And being able to have open conversations with our families about that and having honest conversations. We do a lot of what we call care conferences in hospice, where we get everybody on board to be like, okay, we do one at the beginning, we do one kind of in the middle, We do another one as we get closer to the end, because each time and each stage, things change. Things change and they get a little bit different. In my program of study, as I was completing my doctorate degree, one of the things that I did find to be the same across the board is we have quality indicators that have to do with pain management, respiratory management, and of course, bowel management. I'm a nurse. I'm sorry. I'm going to say the word bowels. I'm sorry. Forgive the nurse in me. But it's important. We got to talk about that too. But what I really looked at was how do we improve that, but improving it from the perspective of our primary caregivers. Because again, as the patient themselves, as we ourselves begin to die, we will not be able to do all of the things that it will take to take care of us till our last breath. So I really focused on how do we improve that education? How do we get everyone feeling more comfortable about what's going to happen? What are we going to be expecting? What does it mean if we say that someone is short of breath? What does it mean to say, are they having pain when they can no longer talk? So teaching the families, teaching the caregivers how to be able to recognize those things and then know what to do about it, but then also know how to call for help, or when you're calling for help, to know what to ask, how to be able to describe it, and could we make those things better? And so I really do think that for myself and my personal life, being a hospice nurse for so long, we have very open conversations about death and dying in my home. I was like, for my family, for my parents, I often ask them about their advance directives. I'm like, just want to make sure we're talking about it and we know what we're doing, because it is important. And I think one of the other things that I feel very, committed to as a nurse, I think as Tonya, as a person, is I want people to feel that they have a safe space. I'm like, death can be scary. I think it can also be very beautiful. And I think that it's going to be one of those things where I tell people, if you want to talk about it, I'm your person. I'm like, we can sit and we can break it down, whatever those questions might be. I'm really just wanting people to feel as comfortable as possible about it. Even as people sign on to hospice, there's still a lot of questions. Maybe you've had a good experience, maybe there's been a bad experience. But again, it's what do you want it to be? And also knowing that hospice isn't necessarily for everyone. However, death will be for everybody. So still wanting to really make sure that whether you end up coming onto hospice or don't have hospice, because it's really not where you're looking to be, but just being able to be very comfortable and wanting to be able to just know what those wishes are for yourself, think about them, have those conversations with your loved one, a close friend, or again, maybe finding a very comforting and friendly nurse that you could just say, hey, I just had this question and want to make sure I know and I understand, what those next steps would be. So I guess I just want to be able to say that I love that we're having this conversation. I love that so many people are here for us to talk about it, and that I hope that as we continue through this night together and even after we kind of depart, that we'll just continue to think about, what do we want those last phases, that last part of our days, and just what does that quality of life really look like for you and for your family.
All right. So our second panelist, Beth, is going to say a little bit more about what a death doula does. Some of you may not have even heard of this, and how death doulas can help support dying well.
Thank you. So yes, I am Beth Eliot. I am a death doula. And before I begin, I just want to note that the stories that I'm going to share with you, are all given with consent, but due to some wishes, some of the names have been changed. So, So my maternal grandmother, who I called Franma, a mixture of Fran, her name, and grandma, right? Franma. When she got diagnosed with cancer, she came to live with me. And in her last weeks of life, she was trying to get to the bathroom by herself, and she fell and shredded the skin on her shin. And in her last days, I remember feeling such awe that that wound was healing as she was dying. And I thought, how can there be such well-being and healing in death? So journeying with my Franma got me started on this path. And I am old enough to have been doing death doula work for more than 20 years now. When I began, there were no organizations and there were very few resources. Today, there are lots of resources, and there is a national and even international organization. And as a matter of fact, I am pleased to let you know that Iliff will soon be offering a death doula certification program that will be open to the entire community. The QR codes are on the papers on your table. Okay, shameless plug done. Let's move on. So what is a death doula? Here's my elevator speech. A death doula is a non-medical, non-denominational, holistic companion who guides and supports a dying person, recognizes their individual needs, and ensures that they feel loved, valued, and affirmed. We do this by creating and holding sacred and/or healing space, whether it be in a hospital, a hospice, or at home. We honor a person's religion, spirituality, or their atheism, agnosticism. We support a person's family and their communities. We work in collaboration with fabulous partners and other providers. And we share resources that help ease the transitions. So the day before Franma died, I made her her favorite meal, despite the fact that she had not been able to swallow food for some time. And she took a bite of every single dish. She savored it and then deposited it in a napkin and took another bite. We found a way for her to relish the food and the way of living that she so enjoyed all the way to the end, even though we had to renegotiate how. So that's it. Helping people in this overwhelming time find ways to honor themselves, their loved ones, and their lives. Now, doulas all have unique strengths, and we all create pretty unique practices. There are doulas who are also chaplains. There are doulas who are hospice nurses. Some doulas even train in complementary therapies such as aromatherapy or Reiki. For me, it was a lot of really deep listening and finding ways to connect. People who are dying often need to talk, and that talk can be very painful for the ones who love them most. Sometimes they need someone to translate things or someone to advocate for their wishes. Sam was struggling with losing his dignity, which for him meant resisting help with toiletry needs and hating his loss of privacy. He and I had a lot of conversations about the challenges about our cultural idea of hyper-individualism, and we read a book together by Ira Byock, nod to him, where he says that in allowing yourself to be cared for and being a willing recipient of care, you're contributing in a remarkably valuable way to the community. Sam and I were able to reframe his loss of dignity into a gift that built his community. Sometimes the work is just sitting vigil, being a non-anxious, grounded presence can ease the way for everyone. I was sitting with a gentleman named Gene, and he had lingered for weeks, unresponsive, but unable to let go. Because I knew him and had worked with him for a while, I knew he was a naval pilot. So I began talking about the weather and how the skies were clear and that he was cleared for takeoff. He died moments later. Sometimes we just need to meet people where they are in a way that they understand. I have accompanied families as they panic, hearing the death rattle, the noise that we call the death rattle. I have shared with families the importance of having a DNR and discussing the advantageous places to keep it. I have been present to support a father when he had to tell his children that their mother died. I've even been brought in to talk to a child about the loss of a beloved pet. I do a lot of legacy work. I record videos of people leaving messages to their loved ones. Teresa, upon hearing that her breast cancer had metastasized, had me help her make birthday cards for her daughter all the way up to her 21st birthday. And then we wrote letters for her graduation, if she ever got married, if she ever had children, and even if she ever had grandchildren. And she left those for her daughter. And while Teresa and I were writing those letters together, Teresa had a chance to share her hopes, her fears, and to talk about what she believes, what she believed death would bring for her. I am a huge proponent of doing something, and here's where we get a little dark humor, so forgive me. I like to call it a death wish. This goes beyond the treatments that you might find in like a living will or a most form or even the 5 wishes, all of which are important, but this is different. This is a vision of how you want to die. And it often starts with that question about where you want to die, right? And what you want to be wearing, and what do you want with you, and who do you want in the room, and who do you not want in the room, including animals, right? People have very different ideas of this. Some people pictured a dark room with candles and quiet. Others want to be in their garden with the birds and grandchildren laughing, right? But in talking about these visions of our own death, ultimately what you're doing is creating space for people to reconcile with this reality and talk about the many ways that death gives us to practice letting go. Ultimately, they all knew that it was very unlikely that they were going to get 100% of these wishes fulfilled. But it does open the door to discussing priorities and give their families a roadmap that they can use to help meet their wishes as best they can. One mother took the ashes of her 8-year-old daughter, Hannah, and she put them in hundreds of tiny little Ziploc bags. And she gave them to everyone who loved or knew Hannah and told us to scatter them in a place and time when we were deliriously happy, ensuring that Hannah was able to be part of hundreds of moments of joy. As a doula, I am often promoting art and creativity because some emotions and losses are best expressed through art. Poems, drawing, music, movies, books, and stories. These can help us somatically when our intellects fail us. Another benefit of a doula is that we can remain with our departed families, with the departed families long past when a hospital staff or a chaplain even can, or a hospice can. To this day, I am in contact with families we contact each other on the death anniversary date. It's become our ritual. So, while there is no way for me to convey the full scope of what death doulas do, I hope this helps better understand how this profound work can enhance our journey towards death. And perhaps it can engage us in understanding that we shouldn't always leave preparing for death to the end, that it is a practice that we can do throughout our whole lives, and tell us a great deal about how we want to live. Thank you.
So I want to point out something really important. These are not either-or kinds of conversations. This may be and. What's shared by each of these panelists, you might experience pieces of all of those kinds of supports in your dying process or for your loved ones. So keep that in mind as you're listening to this. These aren't mutually exclusive. Thank you. So Carrie, how can professional chaplains and spiritual caregivers support dying well?
I'm Carrie Doehring, and I'm the Clifford Baldridge Professor of Pastoral Care here at Iliff for 4 more weeks. I'm retiring on May 31st. And I've had the privilege of teaching chaplains over many, many years, and being part of the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education in my own training, but also particularly in recent years when they've been redeveloping their learning outcomes for chaplains. And a lot of my teaching involves trying to identify specialized knowledge and research on when aspects of one's spirituality and religion is helpful and when it's harmful, especially in the process of dying. And so our expectation of chaplains is that they will be part of conversation circles where they're identifying research that is very relevant for their care. And you see that modeled right across all of us here. So we expect spiritual care to be research-based, and as Kelly represents really well, we want our chaplains to be fully integrated with the care team. And that's especially important in a hospice or hospital setting or a correctional institution or the military, because we want our chaplains to be able to function as a team that provides care for the whole person. And can interface with other members of the team in getting what that person who is dying and what their family members need now. So we expect people to be functioning as part of a care team. And we also would expect in the organization where the spiritual care department is located that they would really respect any sort of traditions and beliefs and practices of those coming for care. And so even though it's interesting, recent research interviewing people who had received care from a chaplain, what they identified as the most distinctive aspect of that care was that the chaplain had a religious or spiritual or existential affiliation. And so chaplains that are what we call board certified, the highest level of certification a chaplain can be, they need a graduate degree like we award at Iliff. They need extensive clinical training. And they also need to be endorsed or ordained by a faith, religious, or existential group. And it was very interesting for me in this research that patients identified that aspect of the chaplain's identity as what made them different from other caregivers. And what that means for us at Iliff, and indeed across associations like the Association of Professional Chaplains and Clinical Pastoral Education, is we want a chaplain to be very grounded in their own tradition. We want them to be able to draw upon that tradition in life-giving ways for them. And we want them to be accountable to their spiritual, religious, faith, existential tradition in ways that make them trustworthy. So they're not only accountable to, say, the institution that educates them, like Iliff, for how they're making sense of things. They're accountable to the Association of Professional Chaplains that certifies them, but they're also accountable to whatever faith, existential, spiritual tradition endorses them and says, yes, you are a chaplain. And here's the complex part, is they're grounded in that tradition. That tradition needs to be life-giving, needs to give them a sense of spiritual dwelling when they're in these very challenging places with other people. And their tradition and education and training needs to make them lifelong learners. And I don't know about you, but many of us, when we encounter a professional who's supposed to help us, we have often a kind of instinctual sense of whether it's going to click or not, right? Now, sometimes that's shaped by our bias and our prejudice and whatever else is going on. But I think one of the things I look for that makes a helper trustworthy is my sense, is this a lifelong learner? Because dying is a learning process. It's a journey together. And we want a chaplain who's able to be on that journey with us. And we want them to be grounded and be able to draw upon whatever spiritually and existentially nourishes them, those relational networks that support them to make them fully available to us. And that's what makes them trustworthy. And especially an important aspect of trust is, do they, if I'm the person who's dying or my family, do they respect where I'm at in this moment, what I'm struggling with, the values and the beliefs that I'm searching for that will help me be collaboratively on this journey together. So that deep sense of spiritual trust. And trust is complicated because sometimes when chaplains are working with families, families may be functioning out of aspects of their tradition that are limiting the ways they can be with each other, and particularly the ways they can work through spiritual struggles. There's a lot of recent research that the more people experience a spiritual struggle, that spiritual struggles will come up when we're dying, when we're accompanying people with dying, because it raises our most deepest questions about what our lives mean, how can we be together, how can we experience the goodness of our bodies even in the dying process, like just a lot of struggles. And so we need to have a chaplain who we can trust with our struggles and who will explore them with us. Especially when family members, as Dr. Arora pointed out so well, have these conflicts, and that can give rise to struggles. One of the most profound sources of struggle is struggles with a condemning God. Now, most of us here at Iliff would think we're all espousing, for those of us in theistic traditions, that we're all espousing to a relationship with a loving, sovereign sense of transcendence, a sense of the goodness in nature. But in fact, I think many people, when they go through existential crises, they can return to experiences, and even childhood experiences, that make it feel as though God could be condemning them. So it's very, very important to create a space where people can work through that and talk about it. And even though a chaplain might find it very difficult to, in a sense, respect that experience somebody's having, that's very real to that person. And so that's the journey you go on with them. And the last thing I'll say, which is very complex to understand, but is what we teach here at Iliff, is we want to be justice-seeking as chaplains. We want to not only care for the person, but think about how aspects of that person may open doors, open resources for them, or close doors. And so we want to be their advocates in opening doors for them to get the resources they need to make the dying process as good a journey as it can be. And there is evidence that, of course, bias plays out in all sorts of ways across all of our institutions. And interestingly enough, implicit bias, which is those automatic judgments we make, the two kinds of implicit bias that has not changed in the past 15 years is bias towards how people look, their body size, and also bias towards age. And in the dying process, some people will age quickly, and then that creates a bias. So we want our chaplains to be justice-seeking in working with a team that advocates giving them as much access to resources as possible, and especially advocate when barriers or struggles seem to be exacerbated by like attitudes of prejudice. So those are the things we would want to find in a chaplain: spiritually trustworthy and respectful, is in conversations with the team and is drawing upon current research and knowledge and making that relevant to our process of dying. And we want chaplains who are justice-seeking.
Super. Thank you, Carrie. And now, Val, what kind of wonderful insights are you going to offer us about how family caregivers and faith communities can support dying well?
Thank you, Kelly. Good evening, everyone. I'm Reverend Dr. Valerie Jackson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. In the Iliff halls, I'm known as Val Jackson. In my faith communities, I'm called either PJ or Pastor Jackson. So since there are quite a few of my members here tonight, I'm going to ask that we stand in solidarity with my faith community and call me PJ tonight. Amen? Okay, so the pastor part is coming out with the amen. The divine source of life has a sense of humor. When I first went to seminary at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, I had no intentions of being a pastor. And I say that now, and I've been in professional ministry for 24 years. But at that time, I had no intention of being a pastor. I thought I was just answering my call to preach. And I grew up in the Baptist church, and so there is a difference between being called to preach and called to pastor. So I thought I was answering my call to preach. And so I went to get my Master's of Divinity with the intention of being a director of Christian education for the rest of my life. With that in mind, I took one pastoral care course, the required one. Because I did not think that I needed it. So for the last 24 years, I have had to learn by trial and error how to do pastoral care, and particularly for tonight's topic in the areas of death and dying. So let's see what I have to say as I sit next to the guru of pastoral care, Dr. Carrie Doehring. Another way that the divine source of life that I know as God has a sense of humor. At the very core of my professional ministry as a pastor, I seek to liberate people, free them, or give them the tools to free themselves from colonization, so that they can live their best lives, their best authentic lives, that they can find the truth of who they really are and live into that. And my hope is, from a very general perspective, that if we live our best lives, that might inform us dying well, if we live well. That's very generally speaking. Now, to get more specific on this topic, though Kelly doesn't want us to talk about the postmortem part of death and dying, that is pretty much where my role comes in. I do ministry in cross-cultural, cross-racial contexts. And the truth is, the way that I do professional ministry does not reflect the way that we deal with death and dying with people and families that look like me. For example, the vast majority of ways that I have to deal with death and dying is by way of memorials. But with families and people that look like me, the vast majority way that they deal with death and dying is through funerals. And the difference is the presence or non-presence of a body. Okay? So I'm going to share with you from the way that I do ministry in cross-racial and cross-cultural ministry. Okay? Unfortunately, even though I'm a faith leader, you would think that people of faith plan towards death because we know it's coming. We are people of faith, and we should know how to find comfort in that. But that's not the case based on my experience. Based on my experience, I have not come across many people that plan to die well. We may do living wills, we may do a power of attorneys, we may have in place what we want people to do while we're in the hospital and may be unable to speak for ourselves, but we do not plan to die. We expect that something miraculous is always going to happen, and we don't get to that point. And if we do plan for it, I have not found that we invite faith leaders or pastors into that part. And I have found that to be especially true here in Denver, that most of the time when I am called in as a pastor, it is after death has already occurred. And so at that point, it's too late for me to have a role in anyone dying well, and my role becomes helping those left behind deal with death well. And so I believe that I have specialized in being the bridge between the moment of death and the family embarking on the journey towards healing and imagining a whole new existence without their loved one, and believing that there is a future without their loved one, or experiencing their loved one in a very different way. I work very hard not to ever use language such as hell, And I think I can very safely say 1,000% that that word never comes out of my mouth. I'm less sure that I can say that the word heaven never comes out of my mouth. But I try very hard not to use that language as well. I try to use language such as another dimension of life or another phase of life. I try to nudge folks towards realizing that though the person is not with us physically, there will be ways that we will get to experience the essence of who that person was. When the call comes in that someone has died, one thing I love about death, I know that's probably a weird phrase, is it brings instant clarity. Most days, most of us are always busy. We're overwhelmed with the number of things that we have on our plate. But when I get that phone call, instantly I'm clear on what I need to do. And everything else is laid aside and is no longer that important. And so from that moment on, I reach out to the family and I seek to make a connection, letting them know that they are not alone. That the faith community that I represent and we are here and we're walking with you. That's where it starts. And then I begin to try and set the stage for the sacredness of what has just occurred, that death is sacred. And the life that we are about to remember and celebrate is sacred and historical. We tend to think that only celebrities or the folk that everyone knows have impact on life. I work very hard to help people to realize that we all are making impact. From the moment that we shifted the universe to enter this world, the world will never be the same again because we existed. And so there's certain language that I always use in a service, and it's language such as, this is a day that we have never seen before and shall never see again. Or we are here to celebrate the life and legacies of one that has never existed before and shall never exist again. And the whole point of that, though I did not get to participate in that person dying well, the hope is the way that I handle the services that come after that, it will help those who are present and those loved ones think about dying well in their own lives.
All right, a round of applause for our panelists. Something that they all touched on a little bit, I just want to make explicit. Professionals in all these different fields have a real commitment to and training in having hard conversations. You know, talking about death and dying can feel really intimidating and really challenging for us, but you are in good hands, right? Because these people represent so many people, too, that stand with them in their professional capacities. So just keep that in mind when you leave here. So in light of this, we're going to continue the conversation. Can I get the PowerPoint to pop back up, please? Thanks. So I know you guys have been sitting like really still and really quiet for a while here. So please know, stand up, shake it out a little bit, get some more food if you'd like to do that. And in the next 15 minutes, we'd like you to talk in groups of like 2 to 4 people, just at the tables where you're sitting, and talk about kind of what's come up for you tonight, process a little bit about what we've been talking about. And we'll take about 15 minutes for that, and then we'll come back together as a group, and we can have some more conversation in the large group. Okay? All right. Great. Thank you. So we can leave this up. Thank you. Nope. Slideshow beginning. What did happen there? What is this doing? This is like, right, everybody, just wrap up your conversation. All right, we've got just about 20 minutes here. An opportunity for you all to ask some questions of our panelists. So we've got a couple awesome microphones, and we'll start in the back here in just a second. So if you want to ask of a specific person or about a specific topic, you can state that up front. But please, sir.
Thank you. Good evening. This is directed to Dr. Hunt and Dr. Eliot primarily, but any of you panelists can address it. Have you dealt with people who have used psychedelics to manage anxiety, expectations, or any of that? It's a new treatment modality that is becoming much more popular. I'm quite curious about it.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, I didn't know if it was back on or not. I actually have, we have had a couple of our patients, particularly those, we have found it to be successful. And I should preface this to say, I am a doctor of nursing practice. I am not a MD provider. So I want to make sure. But it has been, he has a form of dementia, and it actually helps. He had dementia with a lot of behaviors that had caused him to do a lot of odd things. He was going into other people's rooms, doing odd things within his own little apartment space, and introducing that in actually helped to kind of offset and has actually made him calmer. And we have found it almost actually helped his body to be able to relax from whatever was fighting it to enough now where he is in a very calm, more natural of his disease progression. So far, he's been taking, it probably took us a good maybe month and a half to get him there, and it's been now about maybe 4 to 6 months, and he's doing okay.
So also disclaimer, I'm not a doctor. Don't have a doctorate. So. But I'm very interested in the research about microdosing and how it can take away the fear of dying. And I'm keeping an eye, drawing from chaplaincy and Dr. Doehring, research, being research-based, I'm keeping an eye on the research about the implications for end-of-life work. But it's looking very, very promising that the research is showing that microdosing at end of life can take away all the fear. And we're seeing how that impacts the process.
Yeah, and research is also showing, I will add, that just people using psychedelics recreationally without being at end of life necessarily also experience similar lessening of fear about death and dying, et cetera. But there's a lot of research coming out in using it within palliative care, which is just helping alleviate suffering with any kind of serious health condition, but it's really promising for relieving anxiety and depression in particular. So, great.
I wanted to ask everybody, all four of you, about the generation gap and whether age has anything to do with the response of dying well. Because obviously, as we grow older and we're retired or whatever, we think more about it. But then to be at a service for a 40-year-old, it seems to me very different that they haven't thought about it at all. And we were talking at the table, it's amazing to me how many people don't have a will. And they say, well, I'm going to deal with it after I retire, or I don't know when. But it makes it hard on the family to not have a plan. Mm-hmm. But anyway, does the generation have anything to do with your thoughts?
I think that we were talking about how, and I'd like you to each think of this, how in your own families you set up certain traditions, right? Because Val and I were talking about in my family with some tragic deaths in the past 10 years, and my own experience, 17 years in ministry, realizing how valuable it is to have my pastor there. Like when a family member was dying, I always had my pastor come. And that creates a family tradition, you know. And then in my family, I think all of us at this table are in families where we're the ones that initiate these conversations, right? But then you start a family tradition of talking about this. And then the family realizes, wow, this made death such a profound and meaningful process. So just think for yourselves about the traditions you've each established in your families for how you approach death and come together, and see if that also inspires you. It also makes you think of, no, I don't want that, I want this. But do you want to comment on what we were talking about? Whether families do call the minister or not.
Oh, yeah. So, first of all, that's Ben Lewis, and I'm blessed to be his pastor. So I have to take this moment to also shout out Park Hill United Methodist Church. That is our church. Carrie and I were discussing that notion that I brought up, that I'm usually not brought in until after death has occurred. And so we began to realize in talking that that might be geographical, it might be about demographics, right? And whether or not you have that family tradition, right? Because, and in that conversation, I did remember that my first church, which was a small church in Aurora, I did get to be more involved in the actively dying process. And then when I began to move to larger churches, that's when that began to go away. And I don't know if families think that they're imposing on the pastor. You know, they're not going to call the pastor 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I grew up in a tradition where that was normal. In the Black Baptist Church, it was normal for the pastor to get a call 2 or 3 in the morning, and you were expected to be there with dispatch, right? Get there quickly. And so when I got to University Park, in fact, in 2016, was when I first started experiencing not seeing that, and I was like, I must be doing something wrong. They're not inviting me in, but it's just different cultures. Different demographics. But also to your question, Ben, I think age and generation definitely has something to do with it. We have indoctrinated ourselves to believe that only the old die. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about that is if we're watching the news, we can certainly see that is not true. If it ever was true, it's not true anymore. People are dying of all ages, and yet the younger we are, we don't think about it. We don't do anything about it. As we get older, I just got older yesterday. As we get older, those thoughts just start coming in our minds, but somehow we still don't act. And for some people, it's economics. We don't know whether or not there are ways to do a will without having to pay for it. And we're doing good to afford our daily needs, never mind planning for our death, right?
Absolutely.
So I think it's a lot of different reasons like that, too.
Good. Good, thoughtful questions. Who else? We've got several around here.
Well, she put me on the spot. I'm curious what your reflections are on what hope one gets for the things that death actually cannot take away from us. Mainly the relationships that we ultimately have. My card's on the table a little bit. I work as a chaplain at University Hospital. And the fears that families have with people that they cannot communicate with, that this person has been taken from me, and they will be taken from me if they die, and I cannot let that happen. I'm curious what your thoughts are about the idea that this will always be your mother. This, whatever happens in the next 24 hours, in the next 48 hours, in the next 72 hours, that's your mom, and she will always be your mom. And death doesn't change that, and it doesn't matter about heaven, and it doesn't matter about anything else. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that reflection a little bit.
So, for me, it's love. I often tell people I think about love like energy and matter, like it never, it's just recycled, right? It's always here. I've also had some major losses in the last 3 years, and my kids and I talk about how, you know, she might be gone, but we feel her love, right? And that's something that is not necessarily theistic, right? It is something that everyone can identify with and relate with. And, you know, for little kids, I often use, you know, like golden bubble. You're in a golden bubble. Or the invisible string. A lot of you know that children's book that talks about how we're connected with invisible strings of love to everyone and everything. So, yes, relationship, I love that. I might actually borrow that. But for me, I've always centered on the love that doesn't go away when people die. It doesn't go away. It stays with us. We get to keep that. So,
I think it's also helpful to recognize that relationships are very complex. And as many folks here may know, the younger of my two sons ended his life 5 years ago. And I have found, partly through being in a community of spiritual caregivers and chaplains, just this amazing support that has helped me continue to experience the mystery of who he is and the mystery of who I am. And so often when I'm driving around Denver, I'll come to a spot where I remember something vivid. And it'll be a very mixed memory initially, you know. But then I'll put my hand on my heart and I'll breathe in and I'll say, I miss you, Alex, or I love you, Alex. And in that moment, I enter into the mystery of who he is. I don't have this fixed sense of who he is, but we're still in communion with each other. And that allows me to account for a lot of complex feelings and ambiguities. Yeah. And I think it's kind of like when you have a relationship with an incredible work of art, you know, it's always changing in relationship to who you are, but this is an actual, like, person you've been in relation. So I think to take into account the complexity of the relationship is really helpful. And to practice that with people, you know, to see if they can find a body practice that when they experience that sharp jolt of grief, they can just pause and be in relationship.
Lovely. Do we have some over here? Yeah.
One thing that came up in our discussion over here was around agitation and anger that can come at the end of life, and how would you say, you know, planning a way of dying well or encouraging that, how that interacts with those moments of agitation and anger?
Go ahead.
I would say the first thing that I think of is we tell families or patient, if they're still alert, it's okay to be angry. I understand that this is frustrating. And then we talk through it if we can. If they're alert enough to kind of talk us through what they're feeling, most of the time they're able to say, like, I want to get up, I gotta go, I'm used to moving. We talk about what does this mean now for them that their body's not allowing them to do that. For those who are angry, we give space. I'm like, there's days where I'm like, yep, I'm angry too. I'm really sorry that, this has happened. And I think that one thing that I will plug in here is people will often think, well, I don't want to tell my hospice team that dad is now more agitated because they'll medicate him. Because sometimes they get angry about the meds. What we're here to say is we're not going to just medicate someone for the sake of medicating them. If it's going to be helpful for that person, then we will. But so the answer isn't always we'll just give them a med. Sometimes it becomes necessary. But I think really just allowing safe space to say, yes, I understand that you are angry and it is okay.
Let's grab it.
This is a question for Beth about the perception and role of death doulas. Doulas, whether birth doulas or death doulas, have been around for decades, even centuries under different names in different cultures. But of the four professions represented at the table, yours is probably the newest and most evolving yet. And I'm wondering if you've had experiences with confusion and resistance to that role, and even from institutions, and you're becoming a partner with other professions, and how you negotiate and navigate that challenge in offering yourself to families and people on the glide path.
Yes, thank you. One of the benefits and detriments of being an end-of-life doula now is that it is not covered by insurance or Medicare, right? We work independently, and therefore we have a lot of, flexibility and adaptability that come from living outside of institutions. But you also have the challenges of, if we can't afford to make a will, it can be very expensive to hire someone to sit vigil, right? I was fortunate enough to work with a pay-what-you-can scale, and some people were very generous with me, and I could turn around and take on clients that could not pay. So there's ways around those kinds of things. I was also just commenting, we were talking about how I'm not sure everyone needs a death doula. I think that there are some communities. Now, most of my practice was done in New Mexico, and in the Latine community, death doulas don't make a lot of sense because they have strong community and familial bonds that to invite a stranger in feels odd, right? So this is a product of whatever culture it's in, right? And so working from a space of justice, always, and freedom, right? We have to recognize that this flexibility and adaptability is how I deal with any resistance or for example, I worked with an indigenous family, and mostly what they needed me to do was to get his appendix back, because you have to be buried with the whole of yourself, right? And so I was fighting with a hospital admin, right, about how do I get his biological organs in a way that, they're not gonna just hand out, right? So it's very interesting. So I find the resistance people have to working with me are either that it doesn't make sense with their worldview, with their culture, or it's cost prohibitive, right? So whatever we can do to break those down or learn from the cultures that don't need us and put me out of a job.
It's 8 o'clock, and I'm going to honor everyone's time. So we want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to take part in the conversation. Listening is as important as speaking, and we hope that you continue the conversations as you leave here. So with gratitude for all of our lovely experts here, and with gratitude for everyone here with the Women's Alliance and with Iliff, who've helped make this possible with all the arrangements. So thank you, and Godspeed on your journey. Yeah.